welcome back in. Today we're going to discuss some of my favorite running back sleepers for the 2024 season. It's crazy that the season starts in about 2.5 weeks, so we got a lot of drafts coming. So figure we could make this to help everybody kind of figure out who they want to take in the later rounds. I have these separated into 3 different tiers, and so we'll kind of go through each tier as we go. But let's go ahead and get into the first one. And these are basically the 3 running backs I'm going to talk about here. Are kind of 3 running backs that are the team's RB1s that are just going after RB24. So kind of players that I think that are just being a little bit undervalued, that should be valued a little bit higher than what they currently are current ADP. So the first one is Javonte Williams, RB31 or 90th overall. Now I get it. For a lot of people that drafted him last year or have drafted him in the past, he hasn't really worked out. Now we have to remember he was coming off a major knee injury last year, and typically it takes 2 years for running backs to get back from that. And so last season he never really looked like Javonte Williams that we saw his rookie season and at why he was in college. Now the good news is that he's already dropped 12 pounds this offseason, and he is back down to his playing weight that he was at UNC. And there's been all the reports of how fantastic he looked. The burst is back. His breaking tackle ability is back. And, Sean Payton has talked a lot about him as well. And I get it, last season he wasn't phenomenal. 11.2 fantasy points per game. But the one area that he did do a really good job at was a 13% target share, but even more so, 18th in yards per route run. In terms of efficiency, 22nd in evaded tackles, 36th in yards created per touch. Those aren't great. But I think if he can get back to being that guy and looking like the guy he did back his rookie season, I mean, this could be a player that we talk about being like a high-end RB2 this year. And there's also good news that he's in a Sean Payton offense. Sean Payton's offense is typically target the running back out of the backfield. Sean Payton's offenses have been in the top 10 targets to running backs. Even last year, they were actually number 1 in the league in terms of running back target share. So I just think Javonte Williams is in a really good spot. You have Audric Estime, Samaje Perine. I think one of these guys is probably going to get cut. More than likely, it's going to be Samaje Perine. They can save like $3.5 million against the cap. Audric Estime, obviously, they just drafted. I highly doubt that would happen with him. But I think Javonte Williams can be a high-end RB2 this year, at the very least. Keep moving here. Let's move on to a rookie running back this year, and that is Jonathon Brooks, RB32, 92nd overall. Now, he likely won't be ready until weeks 3 or 4. But let's not forget, this is the best running back prospect of this past year's running back class. Now, he didn't produce until his last season at Texas. That was mainly because he was behind one really, really good running back, and that was Bijan Robinson, obviously. But once he finally got his opportunity, he rushed for 1,200 yards, 12 touchdowns, and hauled in 25 passes for 286 yards for last season for Texas before he tore his ACL. Now, good news was this was a clean ACL tear. This wasn't like a multi-ligament tear. And so all accounts is that he should be ready to go, after the first probably month of the season. Dave Canales, who's now this team's head coach, obviously has a pretty good track record with running back. You saw last year what he was able to do with Rachaad White. And so I just think Jonathon Brooks, now he's not something we're going to want to draft right out of the gate. Obviously, he's going to miss the first month of the season. We care way more what he's going to do in the second half of the season. I think he could have like a Breece Hall type, Jonathan Taylor type breakout over the second half of the season where he takes over as this team's RB1. And so I wouldn't want to draft him as like my RB2 because we just understanding that he's not going to provide anything for the first few weeks of the season. But I think if you can get him as your RB3, stash him away on IR, pick up another player in his spot. But I think this could be a player that we're talking about once we get to week 3, week 4 as an absolute buy. So I would much rather have him on my bench ready to go because I think this is going to be a really good second half of the season for Jonathon Brooks. So I'm buying Jonathon Brooks where I can. Lastly, we have Brian Robinson, who coming off the board. His ADP, I really don't get. RB34, 93rd overall. This is a player for the first 12 weeks of the season last year was the RB5 in fantasy points per game last year. RB5. We're talking about 12 weeks of the season, not a couple of weeks, not a small sample size. 12 weeks, he was the RB5 until he got hurt. Last season, this was a player that had a 60% opportunity share, wasn't incredibly involved in the passing game, or he only ran 37% of the routes. But when he was targeted, he was productive. 5th in yards per route run, first in yards per reception. He did have 9 touchdowns last year, 733 rushing yards, 367 receiving yards. And I'll be honest with you, I was not a Brian Robinson guy whenever he came out of college. But last season, he really started to make me a little bit more of a believer in Brian Robinson. They brought in Austin Eckler, which to me is just more of a name value type player. I think his best days are behind him. I think he's still probably going to be involved in the passing game, and which is going to limit Brian Robinson's ceiling because this isn't a player that's going to have some huge workload in the passing game. And typically, I want running backs that are going to catch passes out of the backfield. I think Brian Robinson is a capable pass catcher, but he's still going to have a limited ceiling. But I still think he can finish as an RB2 this year. I would prefer Javonte Williams ahead of him. But Brian Robinson still makes a lot of sense. If you're wanting to wait on running back, you get that anchor RB early, and then you fill out the other positions, and you want to come back and get Brian Robinson. Absolutely love that start. Some honorable mentions really quickly. Jerome Ford, Chuba Hubbard are kind of the same. I think our start season, first month and a half of the season, I think these are probably going to be the lead backs of their backfields. But like I said, once Jonathon Brooks and then even Nick Chubb, once he's healthy, Sounds like reports are that he should be ready around week 4, week 5. I think eventually Nick Chubb kind of takes back that backfield, and so it kind of relegates Jerome Ford back down probably to the level below this. And then you have guys like Gus Edwards, Devin Singletary, Zach Moss. I go back and forth about Zach Moss. Zach Moss was pretty much cheeks before he got to the Indianapolis Colts, and then he got to right next to Anthony Richardson and kind of got that bump from that running quarterback that really helped him up, made him more efficient. And so obviously we're also running behind one of the best offensive lines in the league, but I still think that he's a possibility that he could be a good pass catcher out of the backfield. But there's another running back I want to talk about in the same backfield here in a second, because the next tier that we're going to get to, and this is another tier of running backs that I definitely going to be looking to draft, and these guys that have standalone value. Players that aren't their number one running back on the roster, but definitely are still going to have a sizable role to be able to plug them in as kind of flex options on a week-to-week basis. So to me, the first up is Tyjae Spears, RB 35, 101st overall. Spears was phenomenal last year on a limited workload, 34% opportunities behind Derrick Henry, but he was uber efficient. He ranked fifth in yards created per touch, fifth in breakaway run rate, fourth in juke rate, and 11th in yards per reception. He was also heavily involved in the passing game with a 14.7% target share. He received 70 targets in his rookie season. Now, we know Tony Pollard is probably going to be the 1A. There's been a lot of talk about this backfield, how it's probably going to be a 50-50 split. And I do think that's how this is going to play out, which is still a pretty sizable jump for Tyjae Spears this year. And so for me, Tyjae Spears at 101st overall, I still think is incredible value. Somebody that you're going to be able to plug in on a week-to-week basis. And honestly, if Tony Pollard doesn't get back to being the more efficient running back that he was, wouldn't shock me if Tyjae Spears over the second half of the season really takes over this backfield, because he was phenomenal on a per touch basis last year. So again, another player that's really easy for me to draft. Next up, we have Chase Brown. Kind of talked about this a little bit with Zach Moss, but he has a potential to be the RB1, one of the best offenses in the league. Now, like I mentioned, Zach Moss is now here. Now, this is a very small sample size for Chase Brown. 44 carries, 14 catches for 320 yards and a touchdown last year. But we have seen him be a workhorse in the past. When he had his final season at Illinois, he racked up 328 carries, 1,600 rushing yards, and 27 catches for 240 receiving yards and 13 touchdowns in his final year at Illinois. Heading into this offseason, I kind of was going back and forth on Chase Brown, what I really thought, because, there are some concerns with him, like his vision isn't great. He's sometimes running to the back of his offensive line, but it's hard to deny how explosive he is as a runner. And so, obviously we want running backs in very good offenses. And honestly, another feather in the cap of whoever this RB1 is going to be in his backfield is getting to play next to Joe Burrow, because Joe Burrow has been one of the check down kings that we've seen. I mean, he has been top 5 in check down rate each of the last 2 years. Chase Brown, if he's that pass catching role, I think at the very least he has a standalone value as a pass catcher out of this backfield. And I think he has the potential to really take over the backfield and be the RB1 here, because they have actually been splitting first team reps all training camp. And so I do think there's a path here for Chase Brown to just take over this backfield altogether. Next up, it's Rico Dowdle, RB44, 140th overall. I don't really understand this ADP. He's sharing a backfield with Zeke Elliott. Now, he had a limited workload in 2023, ninth in yards created per touch, and he was top 20 in yards per route run, 361 yards, 144 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. Now, it's hard to imagine Zeke is going to have a huge role at the age of 30, but I will say this, Rico Dowdle is another player that's been drawing a lot of camp buzz, and I think he could play a similar role to what Tony Pollard did in Zeke's final year with the Cowboys a couple of years ago, where Tony Pollard handled about 45% of the opportunities. He averaged about 12 carries per game, 3.5 targets per game. I think that's something we see from Rico Dowdle. Maybe it's in the 10, 11 carries per game, 2 to 3 targets per game. But regardless, another running back on one of the best offenses in the league. Something we definitely should be targeting. Something we should be looking for, because touchdown upside is definitely going to be there. Zeke Elliott is not going to handle some monster workload, and I think it's going to be Rico Dowdle. They did bring in Royce Freeman, but I don't care about him either. Also, very much a Jag. I just think Rico Dowdle could really break out if he can maintain his efficiency that he saw last year. He could see a Tony Pollard-esque type season before he got hurt. So lastly, we have 2 more guys we want to talk about in this range. One is Ty Chandler, another running back. I don't understand why he's RB47. I think he should be going much closer to a top 36 running back, in my opinion. The Vikings signed Aaron Jones over the offseason, but that should be in a sizable role for Ty Chandler, because Aaron Jones at 29 years old and somebody that has never been a workhorse back is not all of a sudden going to start now. I think Chandler flashed the ability to be a contributor last year on limited opportunities, finished 18th in yards per touch, 19th in yards created per touch. And now with Aaron Jones' injury history, he's going to have a limited workload this year. And it's not hard to envision a scenario where Chandler takes over, lead the team in touches by the season end if Aaron Jones ends up going down with some injuries like he did last year. So lastly is Tyrone Tracy. I think he's a little bit more of a PPR option, but still RB58, 197th overall. Now, the beat writers had us all up in a tizzy about a week ago. They put out this report that he went down with an injury, and they made it sound like it was season-ending type of injury that we thought his season was done, which is a shame because Tyrone Tracy is somebody that I definitely love. 5'11", 210 pounds, very athletic, 93rd percentile burst score, 77th percentile speed score, getting a lot of buzz. Now, this is a converted former wide receiver, converted to running back. But last season, as a runner, he was really good per PFF among running backs with 50 plus carries last season. Tyrone Tracy ranked first in yards after contact per attempt, third in elusive rating with a 6.3 yards per attempt. And so I think Tyrone Tracy is a very easy click later in drafts. So if you want to take with your last couple of picks in your draft, I think he could have really good upside because we're talking about Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary's always kind of been a jag, definitely going to be involved. But I think Tyrone Tracy could carve himself out a pretty good role here within this offense that has been getting a lot of buzz. Somebody that has said has looked really good all training camp. Just shame that he got a little bit of an ankle injury. It certainly wasn't season ending like they tried to make it out to be. Turned out to be just a minor ankle injury. He's already been back at practice, kind of working off to the side, so he should be good to go time the season starts. So Tyrone Tracy, really like him as well. Now, lastly, the third tier of running backs, and this is a tier that I don't probably envision myself drafting. Maybe one or two of these guys, maybe. And these are handcuffs. These are pure handcuffs, guys that probably aren't going to have much of a role on their offense. These probably guys that are going to see, 20, 25% opportunity shares within their backfield. Guys like Braylon Allen, guys like Jalen Wright, guys like Blake Corum and Trey Benson. I like all of these running backs, independent of themselves, but it's probably going to take a big injury to a running back for them to pay off. And yes, Trey Benson is playing behind James Conner, and James Conner is someone that's always gotten hurt. And so at some point, he's probably going to have value. So he's more on the upper spectrum. But taking him at RB 36, 109th overall, is just a little bit too rich for me. I think if he was going later around the RB 45 to 50 range, I would be much more of a buyer. But I can't at that cost. You have Blake Corum. Now, you're going to have to believe that Sean McVay is going to go away from something he's always done, really use a split backfield, a committee backfield. I don't think that's really going to happen. And so for me, I think Blake Corum would be a home run if something were to happen to Kyron Williams. But we don't know if that even happens. So for me, a lot of these guys just end up being roster cloggers and guys that just sit there on your roster and you just hope and wait for something to happen. And then when bye weeks come, they're the first guys we drop because they haven't done nothing all year. And so we end up dropping these players. I'm much more of the mindset. I would rather wait until like week 8, week 9. Some of the bye weeks have already gotten out of the way. And then if you have deep enough benches, then start adding these players to your roster because a lot of these guys are going to end up getting dropped. And that's when you start to take advantage of adding some of these guys for the stretch run of your fantasy playoffs by that point. I want players that I can count on a little bit more than guys that are probably pure handcuffs. That being said, who did I miss? Who are some players maybe you might be a little bit higher on than me? Let me know in the comment section below. We'll see you on the next one.